All right, let's talk about tone. And when you think tone, really think exposure. There's a lot more to it. Have you ever taken an image that was too dark or too bright or just didn't have any depth to it? Well, that's really a problem with the tone of your image. Let's talk about all the functions in Adobe Lightroom that relate to tone real quick, and then we're going to go in a more detailed look at each one. So let's start with a quick overview. You can see that we have our image here of this turtle. And we've got a couple adjustments in tone that I'm going to walk you through. The first, which I almost never use, is the auto adjustment. Now, auto adjustment is going to make adjustments to all of these parts of tone, which are exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, as it thinks best. The problem with auto is that it really's got no idea what you're trying to do with your picture, and it has no way to get you there. So you can see, I really don't like the corrections auto made in this case, which is why I personally don't use it. Which brings us to the first great way to undo the changes you've made in tone. You can just double click on the word tone, and what you'll see is everything goes back to the way it was. Really helpful. All right, so now that we know that auto isn't the way to move in tone in Adobe Lightroom, let's see what is. Exposure helps us move the brightness up by clicking and dragging to the right, or down, making it darker by clicking and dragging to the left. Let's go ahead and reset that. Contrast allows us to push the brights and the darks further away, adding some more drama and depth to our image by clicking and dragging to the right there to increase the contrast, or by going to the left to decrease it. Highlights allow us to adjust the brightest parts of the image, well, almost the brightest parts. We can click and drag to the right to make the bright parts brighter, and to the left to make the bright parts darker. Shadows allow us to adjust some of the darker areas of the image by clicking and dragging to the right, and again to the left, and you can see what happens to the image as it makes it brighter and darker in the dark parts of the image. Now the last two here, whites and blacks, are the whitest and the darkest parts of the image. So by clicking and dragging, we can go all the way up and make the brightest parts of the image very, very bright, or to the left and make the brightest parts of the image darker. The blacks are the darkest part of the image that we can either raise or lower in terms of their exposure. Let's go ahead and reset everything. So that's a basic overview of what's available to you in tone. Well, that's really not going to get us a whole lot until we understand what each one of those adjustments does and how you should be using them. So let's get started talking about that. The first thing I want you to notice, and we really need to understand, is actually not anything to do with those exposure or adjustments at all. It's got to do with this up here. In the upper right part of your screen in Lightroom under histogram, which you can hide or you can display by clicking on the triangle. And I always work with it displayed, so please do that in Adobe Lightroom if you don't already. You'll be able to see our histogram. A histogram at its most basic, and we'll talk about more details about what it is later on, but at its most basic, all you need to really understand is that a histogram is a visual representation of how bright or dark your picture is. So you can see here that this picture is a little bit dark, which is how I like it. Turtle's bright, most everything else though is pretty dark. And you can see that that gray outline is tall and kind of to the left. Now, if I simply switch images here, this is a very bright image, and you can see that the histogram has now shifted way to the right, meaning it's bright, right? That gray outline has a lot of area to the right and not much to the left. Now we'll switch back here to the dark image, and again, everything is shifted left. Now, briefly, if you already know that about a histogram, you might not know that those outlines you see behind it are showing us the blues, the greens, and the reds, and the overlays of those colors, so that as we make adjustments to say the temperature or tint, it'll also change the histogram. You may also not realize that when you mouse over different parts of the histogram, it'll display for you where the blacks are, shadows, exposure, highlights, and the whites. And you can see because it's made those areas of the histogram lighter gray than the rest of the background of the histogram, which can be a really wonderful feature, and let me tell you why. Right? So you can make adjustments down here, but most people don't realize that you can also make adjustments right up here in the histogram. So if I want to just bring my shadows up, I can click and drag to the right, and look, my image and the histogram changed. I can do the same thing here in the exposure section. I can click and drag, or in the highlights, click and drag. And you can see that clicking and dragging in the histogram has made adjustments down here in the tone curve and to the image itself, which I think is a wonderful feature. Let's go ahead and reset all those adjustments real quick so I can show you how to make them down here in the tone section as well. Now, let's deal with this image. So very few times does an image come out on my camera where I just love it at the get-go. But this image, unfortunately, is kind of close to that. So I'm going to show you maybe some just minor adjustments to this one, and then we'll go look at that other one here in a second so you can see how it would work on two different images. So as much as I do like this image, I will say that some of the parts of the turtle are a bit too dark, particularly like around the neck where it goes to almost all black. Now, I know it doesn't go to all black because as I go to the histogram and I hover over the Show Shadow clipping box, I can click on that triangle and you see that nothing's changed in the picture. But now if I were to click and drag the blacks to bring them down, do you see that blue that just came over the image? Now those blacks have gone from having information to not having information because they're just totally black now. If I were to click that triangle again, you see that they go away. Now I can either hover over that triangle and see them, in which case they'll come and they'll go, or I can click and hold, and in which case they stay there. It's a really helpful feature. But we don't necessarily want to push our blacks that far down, of course. So with this image, the blacks, some of the areas that aren't all the way black but are still very dark, don't have enough detail to my eye. So I want to bring those up a little bit. So I can do that two ways. The first is I can go into the blacks here in the histogram and click and drag and just bring that up a little bit. Now by hitting the forward slash, I can look at the before and the after. Not much difference there, so maybe I'll go into the shadows, click and drag that a little bit to the right as well. Now let's check the before and the after. Still not enough, so let's click and drag one more time. Ah, there, that did it. We saw the shift in the histogram. Here's the before, and here's the after. And we can see that I get just a little bit more detail in those shadows. And now in those areas in the neck where there was details and texture in the skin that I couldn't see before, I'm lucky that I can now, which is great. So that might be all we want to do with this image, but before we leave it, I do want to explain a little bit about contrast. So we mentioned that contrast tends to add some drama to images, and you can see that this picture's already got great contrast because it's got areas here that are all the way up in exposure, very bright, but still have enough detail, and then areas that are very, very dark. So you've got a really wide range of contrast, right? A big gamut of exposures, which is really helpful. But if I wanted to increase the exposure, I could click here and drag to the right, and you see what happened to the histogram is that it took those midtones and it pushed them towards shadow and highlight, adding some more drama. Now if I go to the left, you can see that it compressed that histogram, brought everything towards the center because it took the shadows and blacks, highlights and whites, and it pushed them down towards the midtones. So that's all contrast is really doing. And you can completely do that manually, as a matter of fact, right? I can take the highlights and bring them up. I can take the whites and bring them up. Take the shadows and push them down, and the blacks and push them down. And you see that in many ways I've accomplished something similar, although a little more extreme when I do it manually there. So that's what contrast does. You're going to want to use a little bit of contrast, but I prefer to do things manually down here in the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks area. So I hope that shows you using this dark image how you can use the histogram to understand your exposure, and then how to make those adjustments in your image using the tone dialog. Let's go to the second image and take a look at what we would do here. Now, in this case, I've actually already made an exposure adjustment so we could see what happened in the histogram previously. Let me undo that. This is a great image and probably doesn't need a whole lot of touching up either. But let's say, for example, that we wanted a bit more contrast, which I might want to in this case because you can see the histogram is pretty centered, right? So if I select contrast and maybe bump it up a little bit, say plus 15, then look at the before and the after, it does look a bit better to me. Particularly look at the face before and after. I think that's nice and accomplishes what I'm looking for. But I can also go in here and maybe bring the highlights down a little bit. Now, there's an issue with that you may have just noticed. If I mouse over this triangle to the right, that'll show me highlight clipping. Now, because I pushed the highlights down, let me adjust that again back to where it was, you'll notice that actually we've got highlight clipping, meaning that's pure white right there. So when I pushed it down, right, the highlight clipping doesn't show anymore, but the colors look weird, right? There was really no color for Adobe Lightroom to work with here. So as I push highlights down, right, it just sort of looks off to me. And that's really what happens when you've got those highlights clipped, is there's no information there for Lightroom to work with. You've exceeded the dynamic range that was available to you. So we'll go ahead and turn that off, because now we know we've got a bit of a problem with highlight clipping, which we kind of could see because we've got some very bright and very dark parts of this image. Nonetheless, I do like contrast being boosted a little bit, and we could probably deal with maybe a little bit more shadow. Now, I'm not going to use any more contrast because the contrast is pushing those brights even brighter, and we know that we don't want to go any further with that because of the highlight clipping that we already saw. But I might want to take my blacks down a little bit as well. Now, if I click before and after, you'll see that we have a subtle but really nice adjustment there to get a good image tuned up even a little bit more. All right, I hope that helps you understand tone in the basic section of Adobe Lightroom. It's so important and probably one of the most valuable tools for a beginning photographer to have. Let me leave you with one final, little bit more advanced tip as well that you can use to really fine-tune the contrast of your image before we go on to the next lesson. So if you hit Option or Alt, depending on if you're a PC or Mac, you can adjust any one of these, whites, blacks, etc. And as you say bring your whites up, what's happening is it's showing you where you're getting clipping. Same thing with blacks. As you click and drag, those images that are showing up that aren't white are getting pushed down to where there's a loss of the shadows. The same thing is true if you go to the highlights, for example, and drag right. Or if you go to shadows and again click Option or Alt and drag left, you're seeing where you're losing detail in the highlights and the shadows. Now, let me tell you how I like to use that as a little bit more of an advanced trick and how to use tone better. On an image that doesn't have highlight clipping problems to start with, as this image does, what I would do is I would go in, I would click Option, and then I would click and drag whites, right? And so in this case, we'll kind of start out where hopefully a good image is less clipping than this. But anyway, I would click it and drag it till I just started to get some. And in this case, we know that we can't do that because we've got those issues we already identified. And then I would do the same in black, right? So black would have started here, and I would just push it down until I got maybe just a tiny bit of clipping in the blacks. That's a way to ensure that you've got a full tonal range from all the way to white to all the way to black, maybe just a teeniest bit of clipping, right? So it's a great advanced technique for you to improve the dynamic range and really that contrast of the image in Adobe Lightroom. Now, I hope that's been helpful. The next segment that we're going to work on is probably, in order of importance. We did cropping, which is what's in the picture, and then we did tone, which is the exposure and the contrast. Next up, we're going to do white balance, because I'm here to tell you, if your white balance is messed up, you're going to have a real hard time enjoying that picture, but also it provides you a lot of great creative opportunities. So let's get started looking at white balance right now.